Welcome everybody, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Annette Gordon-Reed and to welcome you to our annual American Studies lecture, which is also a Black History Month event. And we'd like to thank the US Embassy in London, and particularly Sue Wedlake, who's here on behalf of the Embassy and who leads the Cultural Affairs Office, for co-sponsoring this event with us. This is the moment in our academic year when we have the chance to share a sense of the kind of work that we do in American Studies at Nottingham, where our interests lie, our expertise, what matters to us. And our work is interdisciplinary, it's disciplinary too, across history and literature and media and visual culture and law and politics, and particularly social justice, and we have particular expertise in race and rights. As the largest American Studies department in Europe, we've been hosting a series of Black history events, and so far we've brought about 600 people together so far this year in our audiences, from school children to seniors, both within the university and in the city at places like New Art Exchange. And we would love you, if you could, before you leave today, to fill in the survey, which I think is at your feet or in your seat, because we take feedback very seriously and we will add that into our future Black History Month event programmes. But the really important part of this introduction is to talk to you about Professor Annette Gordon-Reed. She is a groundbreaking scholar. She's the first African-American winner of the Pulitzer Prize for History, and I usually like short introductions, but it's hard to do justice with a very short one, so bear with me for a moment or two. She's a professor of law. She's also a professor of history at Harvard, so she embodies the kind of interdisciplinary scholarship that we value here. Her work is internationally renowned. She's currently the Harmsworth Visiting Professor at Oxford this year. In the US, she was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama, the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, the National Book Award, so many other honours, including now the National Organisation of Women, New York City's Woman of Power and Influence Awards. And these awards are important too, just as important in some ways as those more academic awards. We're really, really pleased to have her as our distinguished speaker. Annette's first book came out in 1997, and it was called Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemmings, An American Controversy. And Annette stepped out in front of that controversy, a controversy that was building during the 1990s in response to 2 centuries of African-American oral history around the fact that the third president of the United States and founding father Thomas Jefferson had fathered slave children. A year later, after Annette's book was published, Dr. Eugene Foster furnished scientific evidence in support in the journal Nature, in the form of DNA, to say that Thomas Jefferson had fathered at least one child by his slave Sally Hemings. And it became impossible to think about race, slavery, liberty, 3 key terms in Annette's title today, without taking account of Annette Gordon-Reed's book. And I met Annette then because I was writing about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings in visual culture and literary history. And she was the important scholar who was at the forefront of analysing and thinking about this controversy. And she did so with a legal scholar's eye for detail, but with a historian's feel for depth and texture, which helped us all very much. She edited a book called Race on Trial, Law and Justice in American History, which includes a chapter by Peter, I think, our head of American Studies at Nottingham. She co-wrote an important memoir, important to those of us who work in civil rights, with Vernon E. Jordan Jr., who is and was a civil rights lawyer and movement activist. She wrote a book about Andrew Johnson, the president whose term in office came after the Civil War. And she wrote a multiple prize-winning book called The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family. And it was that book that secured her the Pulitzer Prize in 2009. And she continues in this important genealogical and recovery research, working on Thomas Jefferson and the empire of imagination at the moment. Today there was a young scholar in our department who described Annette's work as game-changing. And it was, and it is, but it was not an easy game to change. And an example of that is something I saw at first hand in 2000 when we shared a platform with Dr. Foster, Barbara Chase-Reed-Boo, who wrote the novel Sally Hemings in 1979, other scholars, black and white, and we were in Richmond, Virginia, for something that was a public event all day. We were debating and discovering the truth about Sally Hemings. And it gave me a flavour of the controversy and how it had been received, particularly in Jefferson's home state of Virginia. That while some people in the audience were fascinated, others were reviled by the idea of Jefferson having had a relationship with his slave. And those custodians of Jefferson, hagiographers if you like, were still trying to exert a kind of white patriarchal stranglehold on Jefferson's image. But after Annette Gordon-Reed's work, even those people could not ignore the importance of the Hemmingses at Monticello and the lives that Annette has traced. Nor could they ignore her scholarship, or the kind of Thomas Jefferson who has lived so long in African-American counter-memory. So tonight we're really lucky to have Annette here. Tonight she's going to talk to us about America's struggles over slavery, race and freedom, including the legacies of those struggles in culture, law and the American imagination. So please welcome Annette Gordon-Reed.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you again after all of these years. The world is indeed very, very small. I never thought we would meet under these circumstances again in this particular place. It's a lovely city. I've not been to Nottingham before, and I'm getting my tour around England courtesy of the United States Embassy at various talks. I was in Birmingham last week and was the LSE last night, and now I'm here, and I'm very, very happy to be here. I have to say, confess something, I didn't realize there was such a thing as Black History Month in Great Britain. I didn't know it existed. Black History Month, sometimes Black Americans, we're very hegemonic about these kinds of things. We think of Black history, we think of all of this stuff as sort of flowing from us. The original Black history in the United States was started really in the mid-1920s, 1926, by a man named Carter G. Woodson, who founded what was Negro History Week, that expanded to Negro History Month, and it was in February. The joke in America is that we've been given the shortest and the coldest month to have Black history, but you guys have in October. But it was actually, they picked February because this was Abraham Lincoln's birth date, month of his birth, and also it's believed that it was the birth date, month of Frederick Douglass. So it made sense to have it during that time period, and America has celebrated in one way or another since 1926. And it was a revolutionary thing for him to do because people didn't think of Black people as having an influence on history. I mean, there were figures like Douglass, obviously, who stood out, people, Harriet Tubman, a handful of people who were seen as historic figures. But history was seen as being about powerful people, what we call in America, and I'm sure you know the phrase here, great man history. The history of what great men or powerful men did in the past, and not what ordinary people did, and certainly not people who were enslaved, people who were the least powerful people in America from 1619 to 1865, and then afterwards with Jim Crow, that was a continued form of oppression. So the idea of seeing black people as part of history was a groundbreaking thing for him to do, and something that we accept now as a given. History from the bottom up, as it is called, that all people, all types of people, have ways of making their influence known in terms of creating a history that is usable and history that people should be interested in. My title is pretty generic here because I wanted to give myself an opportunity to talk about what I felt like talking about tonight. The words are going to be there: race, liberty, and America, and imagination, but in the particular form that I feel like speaking about it. It's important for me to explain, and you probably know this, because the thing I'm surprised about is how large the American Studies Department is here, to see so many people who are interested in American history. But you probably know who Thomas Jefferson was and what Thomas Jefferson represents to Americans. There's a famous quote by a historian named James Parton, who was called the father of modern biography in America. If America is right, then Jefferson was right. If America is wrong, then Jefferson was wrong. Sort of conflating the nation in the persona of this one individual. So writing about Jefferson is a way to talk about the American imagination. Obviously it's not actually true that Jefferson was America, but he embodies so much of the American paradox, the American struggle over race and over liberty and its relationship to those concepts, that he is a person who is a good vehicle for discussing these issues. And so race, slavery, and liberty. Obviously, Jefferson was the author of the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and the part about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what has been called the American Creed. It is a belief, it is a document that various groups of Americans from the very beginning have looked to make their claim to a place in American society. So Jefferson is writing these words in 1776, and the vast majority of African American people in North America are enslaved. Some of those people take it to heart, this notion that all men are created equal, who see the American Revolution as a chance for them to make their claim for freedom. Some of them see that by trying to appeal to Jefferson and his cohort, to the other founding fathers, to say, how can you say these words and at the same time hold us in bondage or hold other people in actual bondage, not the kind of metaphorical slavery that Jefferson and the other founders talked about, but actual chattel slavery. How can you do that when you've written these particular words? So there were people who made the appeal to Jefferson and his cohort. A number of other African Americans, some people who were free and some who were enslaved, who said, no, we don't want any part of this. We're going to stick with the British. The British are here to take back or maintain their power over the white colonists. They're waging war against them. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so therefore we would throw our lot with the British. And so it's really kind of uncomfortable question for Americans to think about what choice should African Americans have made during that time period. Because on one hand, you have the story of the patriots, patriotic America, breaking free from Great Britain and forming a republic and going off on their own, and the rest is history. You have that story, but what should black Americans at that time period have thought about that? Should they have cast their lots with the Patriots, or should they have gone with the British? And many, many African Americans decided to go with the British. An actual appeal was made to them by Lord Dunmore, saying that any enslaved person who joined the British Army, joined the British forces, had to be the slaves of rebels, not just any slaves, but the slaves of people who were in rebellion, would get their freedom. And throngs of African Americans, sometimes with their whole families intact, left plantations and moved with the British as they moved through countryside, hoping for their freedom. Some of it was not a pretty story for many of them at the end. Some of them were betrayed Many of them did get their freedom. Some went with the British and ended up in Nova Scotia, black settlements there. So there's always this tension in the American story among African Americans about, where should their loyalties have, gone? Who should they have been with? And it's not a simple story of the patriots who are striking a blow for freedom, because the patriots kept many, many people in bondage. And so the question of where African Americans belong in American society has always been there. It's been there from the very, very beginning. And we have been in America from the beginning. The first African Americans in the British colonies were brought there in 1619. They were there earlier with the Spanish in San Agustin down in Florida. But it really begins in 1619. The first group of African Americans, it's not really sure what their status was in Virginia when they were brought over. It was pretty clear that they were enslaved. They were taken from a Spanish ship, apparently, because most of them had Spanish names. But some of these people end up in the following 2 decades after that as property owners. They end up free. So it's not really clear what their status was. It was not, obviously they weren't, they were not free people because they had been, as I said, taken by the Spanish, but how they were treated in the beginning is unclear, because some of them, as I said, became property owners and became free. Gradually, slavery takes root in the United States, and finally it becomes a legal, sort of adopted into a legal system, a code. The colonists changed various provisions of the law. The question of, what the status of an African American was, or a black person or slave was changed. When the colonists came over, you were what your father was in terms of status. And they changed that in Virginia to say you are what your mother was. And you can think about why that would be a better rule if you're adopting a slave system. The sexuality of women was much more under control than that of males. If it retained the old rule that you were what your father was, you would create a whole status of free mixed-race people, and that would be problematic. So gradually, slavery takes hold. The law adapts itself to slavery, to the institution of slavery, even though it was something that was not really known in Great Britain in the way that it was played out in America. Plantation chattel slavery, where people were actual property that were people bought and sold at auction. People divided up and moved across the country based upon laws of descent when a master died. So this accommodation was made, and an attitude about African Americans was formed at that particular time. The laws of the country told people what African Americans were, who they were, and what status they should occupy, to the extent that even free blacks, the presumption was that a black person was a slave. The presumption was not for freedom, it was presumption of enslavement. You can see how that changes the attitude. White people are presumptively free, black people are presumptively enslaved. So this mentality about blacks sets itself early on in the colonial period. So we fast forward to Jefferson, who, as I said, and as you know, writes the Declaration of Independence, sees himself as an anti-slavery figure. He's a figure of the Enlightenment, and he believes in the notion of progress, and that eventually slavery would die out. But it was a belief in progress that did not accept the real full humanity of African Americans, because he could countenance or think that this process of emancipation could take place over decades, over long periods of time. So it was not something, so white colonists could found the actions of the British intolerable, that they had to act immediately because they couldn't stand being enslaved, metaphorically. But African Americans should be free, but whites could take as long as they needed to come to the point where they decided to give up their property. So you have this paradox, this individual who says, I believe in liberty, I actually believe that slavery is wrong, but I am a slaveholder, and I'm not going to tell my other slaveholding brethren that they have to immediately do away with slavery. So he hatches a plan for emancipation that suggests that black people should be freed, slaves should be freed, but they should immediately be expatriated, either back to Africa, or he thought for a time about the possibility of a colony in the West, maybe Saint-Domingue, that the American government would for a time help support the freed slaves, and then they would be on their own. So that was his attitude. That was his solution to this: emancipation with expatriation. And that was what we would call the liberal position, the liberal or the progressive position. Of course, the conservative position was no emancipation, period. But the liberal says emancipate and move former slaves out of the country to form their own country, because he said how could slaves love a country, love a place where they had been treated the way African Americans had been treated. So we have the Declaration, all men are created equal, and on the other hand we have Jefferson, and I'm quoting from Notes on the State of Virginia, the only book he wrote, started writing in 1782 and sort of revised it over the 1780s, in which he directly addresses this question of, what do we do with African Americans? What do we do with black people once they are emancipated? Can they exist in this society with us? We have our beliefs in liberty. We have our beliefs that men should be free, but they have to do this someplace else. And he says this because, number one, how could blacks love a place where they had been treated poorly? They will never forget that. He also says whites will never give up their prejudices against blacks. He says, I venture it as a suspicion only that blacks are inferior to whites, and he says, ventured it as a suspicion, but he didn't really suspect it, he believed it. But being scientific, he's trying to be scientific in Notes on the State of Virginia. He says, I venture it as a suspicion that they are. And so therefore, we cannot mix with people. We cannot mix with these people. Black people are an unassimilable group. And so therefore, the only solution is separation, because if they're emancipated, there will be, and the term they used in that day was amalgamation. Now, Alexander Hamilton, who you probably don't know, who is probably not as well known to people as Jefferson, was the first Secretary of Treasury, and he was Jefferson's arch enemy. They hated each other. They were in Washington's cabinet, and they just despised each other. Hamilton, in critiquing Notes on the State of Virginia, says, well, what do you mean, essentially, that emancipation will cause amalgamation? We know that slavery, and Jefferson, and he says he knows that slavery itself is an incubator for amalgamation. And in fact, so why would you think that there would be more racial mixture outside of slavery than there has been in slavery, within slavery? Now, historians looking at Hamilton's writings are sort of wondering if he is sort of tweaking Jefferson about Hemmings at this point, because he says, as he knows from his own observation of his own experience, that this is the case with slavery, that anytime you have slave owners and people living in close proximity to one another, they're going to mix. So perhaps he was, but whether he did or not, he's stating a truth that was real. Monticello, Jefferson was saying that we want to move slaves far from amalgamation, but Monticello was the place, even before Jefferson and Hemmings had children together, Monticello was the place where there were numerous what people called white slaves. Evidence of intermixture was everywhere at Monticello. In Virginia, at the time, the law was that if you were 7/8 white, you were considered a white person. And there were certainly people at Monticello who were 7/8 white, and they were Jefferson slaves. They were Jefferson slaves because, as I said, their mothers were slaves. So it didn't matter how much mixture there was, what degree of whiteness you had. If your mother was a slave, you were enslaved. And there were many people like that. Europeans visited Jefferson at Monticello in the 1790s, before Sally Hemings had any of her children, and they said, my goodness, there are slaves here who are whiter than I am. So you have this situation where you have the Apostle of Liberty, who is, frightened of, or, says that he's frightened of or concerned about this notion of racial mixture, who's nevertheless has a mixed race family of his own, and also married a woman whose father had 6 children with an enslaved woman. And one of those children, the youngest, was Sarah Hemmings, or Sally Hemings. So Jefferson's wife and Sally Hemings were half-sisters. So slavery was not just a place where people worked and didn't get paid, an institution where people worked and didn't get paid. It was an institution where families, biological families, were created. And so when you think about this question of, African Americans' place within American society, you have to keep that particular fact in mind. People always ask me, well, if Jefferson appeared before you, what question would you ask him? And people always think I'm going to ask him directly about Sally Hemings, which I wouldn't. But I would like to ask him, are you going to make white men send their children back to Africa? Because he knows full well that large numbers of people in Virginia, there was, racial mixture in that form was a common thing. And African Americans have always said this in their family histories, have always talked about this. It was something that was not generally discussed in historical text, or if it was discussed, it was always in terms of, well, yes, that happened, but it was the wastrel nephew. It was the, the person who came to visit. It was funny. I had a friend, well, Christopher Hitchens, the late journalist. We were driving to Monticello once, and I asked him, I said, do English people have a history when they talked about, maids in great houses who got were impregnated? Did they always say that it was somebody from, another town, or that it was never the master of the house or his son? It was always some traveler for some other place. And he said, no, because nobody would be stupid enough to believe that. Making a comment about Americans, but I wondered about that, which he often did. But I wondered about that. Is that a trope that it's never the head of the household or the member of the great family that got the maid pregnant? It was always some visiting, wastrel, terrible person who did it and then kind of went on his way. That's how it appeared in historical texts, and it was rare. People talked about it being rare. You mentioned DNA. One of the things that's happening, interestingly enough, with DNA right now is over the past few years, they've been doing testing on African American males in the South, the Y chromosome, the kind of testing that was done on the Jefferson Hemings and descendants, and have determined that upwards of something like, in some communities, 45% of African American males have European Y male chromosomes. And that's just the guys, that's from the guy side. So we're talking about a population of people who have been mixed bloodlines that's been kept secret, lots of rejection by families, obviously. So this whole question of black people's place in American society, Jefferson can't really address because of what's going on in his own life, but also he can't acknowledge or take into account that he's not talking about the other people. In many instances, he's talking about family, blood, biological family that he's suggesting have to go off somewhere. And sure enough, after Jefferson dies in 1826, in 1830, there's the Nat Turner rebellion, and a number of people are killed in Virginia, and they get the idea we got to do something about slavery, and we got to do something about free blacks too, because they think that free blacks are fomenting or making enslaved blacks discomfited in their position. So they adopt this attitude in Virginia, that adopt a rule that says they create a special census, and they go around to free blacks and ask them if they want to go back to Africa. And they go to Sally Hemings and her children. They're living in Charlottesville at this time, near Monticello, and they asked them if they want to go back to Africa. Now, you know, Sally Hemings' father was English, was Welsh actually, and her grandfather was English. I mean, she's 1/4 black. It would make more sense for her to come back here than to go back to Africa. But they ask her if she wants to do this, and she says no. And her children, who are 7/8 white, say, no, we don't want to go back to Africa either. So this notion that any part of blackness makes you alien and ties you to Africa or some other place where you should be was very, very much embedded in American society. And so you think of this country, this new country, that's trying to figure out its place in the world, that's trying to figure out this conception of citizenship. You know, how does that affect African Americans? With the Declaration, with its ringing rhetoric, black people taking that to heart and making the argument for inclusion. The Constitution, which I should also mention, is the other foundational document in American canon. The Declaration is not law in the sense of, you know, you cite the Declaration as a form of law, but it is law, and it is foundational law in that it creates the United States of America. And it's the point at which it said, we're no longer going to follow English law. We're no longer under that law. We're going to create our own law. And the document that follows after that is the Constitution of the United States of America, which recognizes in its own way slavery. The word slave, they didn't want to put the word slave in the document or slavery in the document. They talk about persons held to service. It's clear who they're talking about, but don't want to put the word slavery in because, you know, for a republic that talks about liberty, that says it's based upon the notions of freedom, to have that word in there was too much for people. But nevertheless, they recognize it. They recognize it with the fugitive slave clause that allows owners to recoup or to get their slaves back if they run away from a slave state to a free state. They recognize it with the 3/5 clause that counts slaves as part of the population for making up representation in the House of Representatives. And a historian named David Wallstreicher, who is now at CUNY, the Graduate Center at CUNY, has written a book, Slavery's Constitution, that talks about all the other provisions in the Constitution that aren't explicitly about slavery, but nevertheless were crafted and put there in consideration of slavery, because it's very key to understand that slavery is about property, and the right to property was at the base of the formation of American society. So asking people to do away with property, we think of it, property in human beings, but it was nevertheless property. And so a constitution that's set up for due process against, you know, takings of property, that makes it clear in the Federalist system that the Federalist, the national government cannot interfere with slavery. We have lots of arguments, and I'm sure you may have heard them, or you see them in newspaper talking about states' rights, the rights of individual states, and people who don't want to admit that the Civil War was about slavery often say, no, 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 it was about this principle embedded in the Constitution about states' rights. We have a national government, and we have state governments who are sovereigns. They came into the compact as states. You know, states like it's a nation, like many nations, 13 many nations that come together in a confederation. And then lately, after the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution was supposed to knit them closer together, but it knits them close together with the proviso that states have rights. And that was very important to Southerners because they did not want federal intervention with the institution of slavery. So you have a declaration that people, you know, as I said, groups use for their own purposes to make a claim for their rights to American citizenship, full citizenship. It's something that means something to the other people in the world. Ho Chi Minh, David Armitage has written a book about the Declaration. It talks about how many other countries, how many other people who are fighting for, within countries who are fighting for their own rights, use the words of the Declaration as inspiration. Not many people want our Constitution. That's one that has, I mean, that's strange to people. More people want to adopt a parliamentary system or whatever. The Declaration is great, but the Constitution is problematic, and it's problematic for foreigners, and it's problematic for some Americans who see it as a document that is strong in many ways, but has structural weaknesses that make it difficult for us to do some of the things that we need to do. So you have these two documents there. A declaration that talks about freedom and a constitution that some people see almost as a counter-revolutionary text, in a way, because people were concerned about the possibility that more radical elements in states might do lots of different things, and this was a way of tamping down on revolutionary fervor. So we have these two documents that sort of define the American character in ways, and some ways that are somewhat contradictory. But in both of them, the question of how African Americans fit into this scheme, as I've said, is a problem. It's a conundrum. And we think, to some degree, or people like to think, that the Civil War, that Jefferson foresaw, in 1819, 1820, there was a crisis in Missouri about whether or not he was going to come into the Union as a slave or a free state. And Jefferson sees this and he says, it's like a fire bell in the night, that it could be the death knell of the Union. He thought that the fight over slavery would in fact split the country. And it eventually did. And so after the war, we have this Constitution changed, amended, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that are supposed to settle the question about black citizenship. Jefferson had said, this can't be done. They can't live here and coexist with us as equal citizens. Jefferson believed, as I mentioned before, and one of the reasons he's concerned about this amalgamation question, the way it rises, is that Jefferson saw the community, the nation, as the family as a microcosm of the nation. So you have a family, you have community, and then it radiates out to the nation. So how can you say that people are equal citizens if they cannot be in your family? How do you say you're an equal human being to me? We're all the same, but we don't have the kind of cohesion, we don't have the possibility of joining together in individual families. He could not imagine a society of second-class citizens where there would be a republic, but there would be first-class citizens and second-class citizens. And so he couldn't, because he didn't think that whites would give up their prejudices, or he didn't want to give up his prejudices, he couldn't see how you could have that equality. So this notion of family and community and nation all blend together and explain why he didn't think that this could work. Now, the Civil War and these amendments that I mentioned answered Jefferson on this point, because they make it plain that blacks are citizens. The 14th Amendment, if you're born on U.S. soil, you are an American. And that's that. So there's no question about, blood, there's no question about ethnic origin, there's no question about race or anything like that. Birthright citizenship, which has become quite a controversial thing right now, you may have heard. That's what the 14th Amendment establishes. The legislative history of all these amendments is clear, that it was about bringing blacks into citizenship. So Jefferson is answered in that question. Now, in those amendments. Now, the problem is that even though the amendments were there was a reaction against that. During the period of Reconstruction, people fought back against the idea of blacks as citizens. The states in the South wanted to maintain their control, and so when they talked about maintaining states' rights, what they really meant was, let us handle, and they would have said, our Negroes, the way we want to handle them. So states' rights becomes a cover for lots of ugly sorts of things. It's a retort, it's a pushback against the notion of a federal government that wanted to push black citizenship on to whites. So even though the question was answered on paper, it wasn't answered in reality. I should also say a bit about Jefferson in the Civil War era. Quite a controversial figure there. The Southerners did not like Jefferson. And the reason they didn't like Jefferson was because of the Declaration. Alexander Stephens, in a very famous, called the Cornerstone speech, he actually says, we reject Jefferson. We reject Jefferson's formulation that all men are created equal. The Confederacy is built upon the proposition that the African race was born to be enslaved, that was their purpose, and that it was actually an affirmatively good thing. African chattel slavery was an affirmatively good thing. So you have this figure, again, who is at the center of the debate about what America is, and what America is going to be. You have Southerners who reject him. You have Northerners who reject him for a point because they think that his states' rights talk led to the Civil War. But he's always there. I mean, people wonder why there's so many books written about Jefferson over and over again, why people sort of engage him all the time, is because all of the American questions, the Central American questions, are questions that he asked and that his life implicates. Liberty, the question of race, the question of the American family, the question of interracial relations, all of it is there. So this figure is at the center of all of this. He's rejected by both sides to some degree. African Americans, nevertheless, keep pointing to the Declaration. David Walker's Appeal, talks about the Declaration. Frederick Douglass does a famous speech, what is the 4th of July to me, but he's being ironic. He's clearly saying, look, folks, you're congratulating yourself, but in fact, look at what's happening here. And he actually does believe in the credo of the Declaration of Independence. W.E.B. Du Bois, other black leaders, strangely enough, talk about the Declaration. Whether they, feel how they feel about Jefferson, it's one of those instances where something an individual does transcends, or his words transcend what you think about him personally. I know I've been to many, many events with black people, and it's not uncommon for people to mention the Declaration of Independence, to mention the words of the Declaration of Independence. So it's a strange thing. He occupies a strange position even in the black psyche, because he's said these words that were a promise that Martin Luther King in the March on Washington describes as a promise, that they're there to see this particular promise fulfilled. And he says that in the speech. So Jefferson is a continuing figure all throughout American history, a person who's a slave owner, a person who has many, many flaws that I've talked about, but nevertheless is a touchstone for lots of individuals. In Monticello, has anybody been to Monticello? That's a good number of folks for being overseas. Monticello in itself is a shrine to Jefferson, but had also become a spot where people come and talk about the paradox of liberty. There was an exhibit that started at the Smithsonian to open the new African American Museum that's going to be on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It's right next to the Washington Monument, so people aren't going to be able to hide from this one because it's right there. And the opening exhibit was Slavery at Monticello for all the reasons that I said before, because that's a place where you can go and talk about liberty and race and slavery and all of those things embodied in this one individual's life. And this exhibit has traveled around the country. It has gotten really, really good reviews, and it started a lot of conversations about the question of slavery and the place of how it continues to affect us as we try to grapple with the question of where black Americans exist, or how black Americans exist in the United States. I did a piece for the Financial Times not long ago about Ferguson, and one of the points I make in the piece is that even though on paper everything is okay, everything is set in the Constitution, legal opinions that interpret the Constitution, make it plain. It's clear that black Americans are citizens, but the actions of the police in many major cities in the United States, well, actually, I shouldn't even just say in major cities, sort of counteract that notion. I'm sure one of the things that has become clear since Ferguson, you go online and people put up videos of black encounters with police officers, and we see the sort of double standard in treatment. There's a horrible story about a man who was walking in Walmart with an air gun, and he was on video because everything was video there. He's walking with an air gun that he picked up from one of the displays, and somebody calls to the police and says, you know, there's a man walking around Walmart with a gun, and he's pointing it at people. Now, he was not pointing it at people because he's on video. You could see him all maneuver. He's just sort of walking and talking on his phone. The police come, and 5 minutes later, he's dead. You know, he's just dead. Now this may surprise, it won't surprise you, but you'll get a sense of how different our culture is than yours. You know, the state that he was in was an open carry state. You can, in fact, walk around in Walmart with an assault rifle. You can. So that's that. Talking about that amendment, we talk about the Constitution. That Second Amendment, a Bill of Rights, gives you the right to do that. And I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but it's to show you the differences. I mean, there are white guys who walk around. You could walk around in Walmart with an assault rifle, and nobody's going to show up and shoot them. But a black person with a rifle becomes an immediate threat. Another video where, and I can't believe this guy actually did this, but his friend, you know, with a phone, filmed an encounter with the police officer where the guy is walking around with a gun. And the police officer comes up and says, we got a complaint. They say you're walking around with a gun. Again, another open carry state. And the guy is saying, you know, I have a right to carry a gun. Why are you encountering me? And the police officer doesn't have an answer to that. He just keeps telling him, well, you know, there are people who are concerned. Well, yeah, there are people concerned because there's a black person with a gun. Probably would not have called if there had been, I don't know if they would have called if a white person, but if a white person had a gun, it's not likely that the police officer would have continued to harass this person because it's an open carry state. And if it's an open carry state, if a white person can carry a gun into Starbucks, if you think that's the right thing, then a black person ought to be able to carry a gun. I mean, that's an extreme example of it. So the bigger problem is with the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, and stop and frisk, where young African-American males are stopped and frisked at a much, much higher rate than young white males or other groups, even though, and search for drugs, even though blacks are no more likely to use drugs than whites. In fact, some kinds of drugs are less likely. But marijuana arrests that give people records that then make them unemployable, all those kinds of things that suggest that people still aren't comfortable. The notion that blacks are second-class citizens is played out in policing. And this is related to something else that I should have said that Jefferson talked about, that what would happen after emancipation, there would be a race war, that there would be unending conflict. And people kind of laugh at that and say, oh, that's ridiculous, a race war, because you think of, you know, everybody, you know, gathering up their arms as a shootout. But one of the points that I make in my op-ed piece was that there has been sort of a war going on against African Americans. And policing is a form of that. I mean, policing, if you make it impossible for people to walk down the street, and I'm not even talking about with guns, so that's another question, but the use of the abuse of the Fourth Amendment to arrest people, to decide to deploy people in certain neighborhoods and harass them as they're walking around, to create this kind of tension, then you're not a citizen if you can't walk freely. That's what Americans are supposed to be able to do. And African Americans, young African American males can't do that. I have a son who's 22 and we live in Manhattan, and I'm terrified when he's out. not just from, the possibility that something could happen to him from other criminals, but from the police officers, because he's 21, he's 22 years old, and, at that age, and he's been raised to believe that he's a citizen. He's been raised to believe that he's free. And so if somebody bothers him, he might talk back. But he's talking back to people who have guns. And so you have to talk to your children about how to encounter the police. And at that basic level, at the level of movement, of free movement, there's a problem. And that suggests that even though what Jefferson said is unpalatable, the predictions that he made about how blacks would live in society or what would happen after emancipation, how unpalatable that is, how it makes people angry to think that he would say that, it's not wholly crazy. Because we have, as I've said, had a form of a Cold War and a hot war. After Reconstruction, lynching, all those kinds of things, voting rights, 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote. When I was growing up, the polling places in African American communities always changed. Every time there was an election, you had to find out where you were supposed to go to vote. The voting places for whites always stayed the same, so you would know exactly where to go. You may have heard recently that there's a dispute now about efforts that people think are efforts at voter suppression. And largely African American, in ways that disproportionately affect African Americans. So this question hasn't been answered. I mean, we've answered it on paper. I don't want to make it sound like nothing has happened. For heaven's sakes, a lot has happened. When I grew up, even after Brown, my community was still sort of resisting desegregation. When I was a little girl, when I went to the doctor's office, I went to a separate waiting room from whites. Blacks went to the movies, blacks sat in the balcony, and whites sat, another place. So within my lifetime, that kind of stuff happened. And so it's changed. I go back to my hometown now, and the social scene is completely different, completely much more relaxed. The economic power hasn't transferred. The economics are still the same, but socially it's a much more relaxed place. It's a much open place. People are mixing. It's all different kinds of things openly, not secretly like they used to do. All that kind of stuff has changed. So I don't want to say that there hasn't been change, there hasn't been progress. I don't want to say that Jefferson was exactly right, but he identified some real problems with people who are different, coming together, living together, and on what terms that can be done, and whether or not it could result in the kind of first-class citizenship that he thought everybody should have. He just didn't have the confidence that blacks could have it in America, that he knew. We've made progress. We've proven him wrong on a number of fronts, but we have a long way to go. People always ask me about the election of Obama and whether or not. I mean, there were some people who thought that this meant we were that term post-racial. I don't quite even know what that's supposed to mean. I guess I do know what it's supposed to mean, and I'm being, facetious. But that was a sort of naive hope, the idea that a black president will change every single thing. It's been a rough time for him. But I was telling people earlier today, I'm hopeful because there are generations of people, young people, little people, children, not young adults, but children who have grown up with a black first family, with a black president, who understand that that is not a limitation anymore, and that's a big deal. I mean, we have to wait to see what that means for them when they grow up. But I think that that's a step forward. And I think Jefferson probably, well, obviously would be astounded if we were to bring him forward, would be astounded by this turn of events. I don't know whether he would be happy or he probably, well, you can't make a decision. Someone else asked me, what would he be more upset about? Barack Obama as president or Hillary Clinton as president? And And for me, there's no question that he would have been much more upset about Hillary Clinton as president. Not because of her politics, but because of her gender. I mean, gender was a big problem, big issue for Jefferson. He ventured it as a suspicion that blacks and whites were different. I mean, it was an article of faith for him. It was clear that women had a sphere and men had a sphere, and the woman's sphere was not in power. So I think that would have seemed more, I mean, he knew there were queens occasionally, but that usually happened when something went wrong. So he would understand that could exist. He would see, but, you know, he knew that black men were leaders. And he would say, you know, Barack Obama, I mean, you know, he's black, but, you know, he's a man. Hillary Clinton would have been a tougher thing for him to accept. So, you know, race is at the forefront of, I think, a lot of problems that Obama has. But I don't think it's a hopeless situation, and I do think that we have made enormous strides. And I just like to think that it can only get better. I mean, that's the only thing to do. I'm generally an optimistic person. Reading history sometimes should make me less optimistic than I am. But when I read Notes on the State of Virginia and I compare it to the Declaration of Independence, I prefer to stand with the Declaration of Independence. And I think that that's the better spirit that defines America. And I think it offers hope to people who are not Americans, as it has over the years. So with that, I'd like to take your questions. I've gone on longer than I expected to, but I'd like to take your questions. Are you directing traffic?
I am directing traffic, yeah. I think I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then open it up to everybody else. I mean, so much to think about there, but one of the things that I thought was intriguing and people smiled at was this idea of bringing Jefferson forward to now and what he would think about things. And in terms of his idea that the American family is what goes to make the nation, I wondered what you thought Jefferson would think about the controversy over the Hemmingses wanting to be buried in the Monticello churchyard. In other words, the controversies that happened in the wake of what we all discussed.
Well, you know, if people don't know, after the DNA came out, the DNA results came out, there was a controversy about whether or not members of the Hemmings family could be buried in the Jefferson family plot at Monticello. Now, Jefferson died bankrupt, and the only thing that was left in terms of land was the graveyard. And there was a set amount laid aside for that. And then later on, as more people died, they were deeded other property. I love this, I'm a property professor. There was another deed that said, the first deed was to the children of Thomas and Martha Jefferson. The second deed said to the children of Thomas Jefferson. So there are two conflicting, there are two ways to interpret these two particular documents. Now, the thought was, the only thing that was left to Jefferson's descendants today is this graveyard and tending the graveyard. It's a group called the Monticello Association, and they're his legal descendants. And they had a vote, which they'd never done before, as to whether or not the Hemmingses could be buried in the graveyard. I should say, no Hemmings actually wanted to be buried in the graveyard. In fact, they didn't want to be buried in the graveyard. The dispute was between the legal white relatives. One group that said, of course, they should be buried in the graveyard. The other group said, never. And it's funny because you would think, what the divide was. People would think that it was the divide between people who were young and old in the family, and it wasn't that. It was North and South. It was the whole division of the Civil War, essentially, is between people who said they should be buried there and people who said that they should not. So the Monticello Association is still holding firm on not allowing the Hemmingses to be buried there, even though no Hemmings want to be buried there. They're still fighting amongst the relatives. I think, well, what he would think about, he would be mortified. I mean, first place, Jefferson, I think, would be stunned that there are actually people who study his slaves. Remember I said at the beginning, I mean, history, he thought history was about what great men did, not about slaves, about slaves' lives. Someone wrote to him and asked him once, they were going to do a biography of him while he was still living, and they asked him for the names of his grandchildren. And he said, why do you want to know the names of my grandchildren? They'll just bore people. They don't have anything to do with, my public life. So I think he would be mortified by having family issues discussed. This notion of the personal is political and all that. I mean, that's way before anything that he would have accepted. So I think he would just be mortified by any discussions of family problems, of family conflict together. And he would just be surprised. I think that there are people who know the names of his slaves and the generations and what they did and all this kind of stuff. Just mortification is the word.
I remember, I think I was thinking of it because of that idea of what he would or wouldn't like. And I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember somebody being interviewed, one of the white Jefferson descendants, and saying, it isn't the issue of race that concerns me, it isn't about racism at all, we're snobs.
Yeah.
And that's why we don't want...
She did say that. Well, somebody else told me that someone said, but if we let them in, there won't be room for us.
It's a small plot.
It's a small plot. So it's people fighting over property, and it's property in a literal, actual sense of property, but property in the sense of their ownership, of the connection that they have as descendants of Jefferson. I was saying the other day, if somebody told me that my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had a mistress and children, I'd say, oh, that's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't, how dare you? I mean, it wouldn't register with me. But because he's Jefferson, they have sort of, if somebody said that about my grandfather, I knew my great-grandmother. So somebody that that's close to you, or is close to somebody that you're in some reasonable proximity to, you feel one way about it. But because he's Jefferson, they have sort of collapsed him. He's like granddad. He's much closer to them than you would think, and they have much more of a stake in him than you would think in somebody who's like because who knows what they're, doing back in, 7 great-grandfathers back again. But he means something to them because they're so close.
I could go on all the time, but I don't want to, because I want to open it up to the audience, and we do have some roving mics around. So if anybody would like to come in and ask Annette a question, we have some at the back there.
Is it on? Yeah. I was interested that you started your talk by discussing how the first Black History Week was based on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, a white man, of course. I was wondering, as with Jefferson, whether you think that Lincoln and his sort of developing thought on race, his political career, and the mythology that surrounds him, whether he embodies some of these sort of issues in the same way or in different ways to how Jefferson does.
Well, he does. He too is a controversial figure, because there's this notion that Lincoln freed the slaves, and people don't want. We're sort of moving beyond great man history, the one person who is responsible for this huge social movement, when in fact there were slaves were leaving plantations, they were, freeing themselves. I mean, it was a process of a lot of people being involved in all of this. I don't think he embodies the creed in the same way that Jefferson does, because there's a real cult of the founding fathers in America. And I don't think, because you're a much older society than we are, the founders. And when people talk about the Constitution and they talk about originalist interpretation of the Constitution, they kind of conveniently skip over 1865, the Civil War amendments, and they go all the way back to 1789. When that Constitution doesn't, Madison's Constitution doesn't exist in the same way. I mean, the structure is still there, but the 14th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, particularly the 14th Amendment, have transformed it, American law. So people don't even know who, they don't fixate on those people in the same way. So Lincoln is considered America's greatest president, and there's great reverence for him in a number, in many places. He's Abraham Lincoln, but Jefferson, because he's attached to the beginning, and because he has the Declaration, Lincoln uses the Declaration in the Gettysburg Address. Basically reformulates it and says, all that all men are created equal. What we really do mean blacks too. And so now that's what we're fighting about here. That's what Gettysburg, we've the dead have consecrated in this battlefield, and it's because we're moving forward with everybody there together. So he's an iconic figure in a different way than Jefferson, because he's not a founding father. He's not part of that, and the pantheon is, I don't mean that, but the way people see it in the same way. I have, I think, more sympathy for Lincoln than many people do today, maybe many academics do today, because the cult of Lincoln is problematic. But, it's so hard to do anything. I mean, but there's something at some level about, historians, I want to beat up on us for a second. Criticizing people who are doing things. I mean, we write about stuff. But to be in the position to have to do things, to have to make decisions, to send people off to die, to decide, I mean, that's tough stuff. I mean, it's easy to sit back and carp. So there are many flaws and problems with Lincoln and the racism, but that's a part of time. People don't want to admit that, but that's a big part of white supremacy. Is as much a part of the story as republicanism or any other kind of doctrine, whatever you have at this moment. And that's a part of his life as well. But gosh, making decisions is tough. And if you look at pictures of him, the series of pictures of him, what the war, what that does to him physically is just astonishing. And so I am a bit more, so he was a racist. And, he had hard racial feelings. Yeah, but that was par for the course at that time. But he was the right person at the right moment. And that's what counts.
Thank you. Sorry, we've got one down here, Stuart, in a moment. And where is the other one there that I'm missing? Oh, okay.
Oh, okay then. You spoke very eloquently about the effects on young black men and on what you see as a sort of continuing tradition that goes back to Jefferson's own sort of inability to suggest that black people could have equal citizenship. Do you think there are similar traceable effects on black women, and what would you say that those are?
Well, certainly the devaluation of African American women begins in slavery. There was the notion that only enslaved women, worked in the fields. That wasn't true, but they were fit to work in the fields. They were seen as being more like men. They were, animalized in a way. So I think it plays itself out not in the sense of black women being a threat, but black women not being women in the way that other women are. And so the devaluation of black women, the sexuality, black women are there was a legal theorist, Thomas R. Cobb, who wrote a treatise on slavery, and he says of black women, there's no known instance of the rape of a black woman because black women always consent. So that attitude about African American women, number one, saying that they are, suitable for drudgery, for work in fields, but they're also easy, and which is what people always say about any other culture that they want to attack. They attack the women. of that culture. Everybody thinks that the women of somebody else's culture or race are easy because so much is fixated, so much about our life is fixated on the status of women and the position of women. So yeah, it affects women, but it affects women in different ways. And then you have the double thing of within the black community, because of patriarchy, the males in that community adopt the attitude of other guys. All guys think that they should, not all guys, but it's not uncommon for guys of all races to think that they should be in control of things. So there's the sexism, but also the devaluation of black women's femininity and womanhood. Thank you.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. At the beginning, you mentioned Black History Month, and it's clearly a wonderful thing because it's brought you here and we could hear you speaking. But as you were talking, I was reminded of an interview from 2005 that Morgan Freeman gave on the program. I think it was 60 Minutes, and he was interviewed by Mike Wallace, and he said that he thought Black History Month was ridiculous, and he wanted to do away with it, and where was White History Month or Jewish History Month in the case of Mike Wallace. So do you have a thought on that? Because he was asked, what do we do about racism then, and his response is, well, just stop talking about it. But is he right? Is Black History Month part of the problem, or
I saw that. I mean, I understand what he's saying, this question of separating it out and giving it one, okay, now we talk about Harriet Tubman, now we move on to something else. It's problematic in that sense, but on the other hand, I think the notion of highlighting history's importance is good in and of itself. Whether it's Women's History Month or LBGT, I guess that's June, month, or whatever, I think as a historian, I like the highlighting of history, but I understand where he's coming from, because the suggestion is, Black History Month should be History Month. Every month should be Black History Month because blacks are part of American history. But I still think that there's a need to focus upon race. I know lots of people don't like that, and they think, he says the way to get rid of racism is stop talking about it. But that's not talking about things doesn't mean that it's not real. That's denial in a way. And if you leave things, if there are problems and you don't discuss them and you leave them unsaid, it keeps whatever hierarchy is in place. The French like to, point out that they don't count, don't know how many black people are in France, because if you're French, you're just French. But what that means is that you don't know how many blacks are in corporations. It turns out that there are not many. How many black CEOs there are, how many, there's no way to count and figure out how you're doing, how you're measuring progress that way. And I think that can obscure, not talking about stuff can obscure a lot of problems and leaves hierarchies in place. So I definitely understand the problem with the notion of carving out one time when you're supposed to be talking about black people, because black people are a part of have been a part of America from the beginning. The vast majority of African Americans, I remember being at a Yankee game one time, and some guy got up to bat, and this guy got up and said, "Go back to Africa," or something like that. I'm thinking, the vast majority of African Americans, the descendants of slaves, were brought to America before 1738. After the slave trade ends in 1808, and there were people who were brought in illegally, but the vast majority of African Americans have been here since the early 1700s, been in the United States since the early 1700s, way before the descendants of most of the people, the guy, by the looks of him, who would have yelled, "Go back to Africa," the Ellis Island story begins much later than this. So the idea that blacks are separate is problematic, but by the same token, you have to push at things. You know, you have to talk about things. You have to put things out there, and it's good for young people, for kids to hear that, and then begin to think about it. And eventually, we may evolve to the point where we don't have to have it. But I think it's needed right now.
And if I remember rightly, wasn't one of the things that Morgan Freeman didn't talk about the fact that different people are talking to each other in different places? So in our Black History Month, as we go out into art galleries or we go out into different communities, or people come here, I think it's about who's talking to whom as well. And I think he was talking about people telling the same stories over and over again in history, in Black History Month.
No, and it's about broadening the spectrum of them. And I bring up Harriet Tubman because that's the one figure that everybody kind of knows. But things have become much more sophisticated in terms of dialogue, the kinds of things that people talk about, the questions that it raises. It's always, I think it's good to have these kinds of discussions. We may not have to have them in the future, but as I said, I think it's critical now.
Question over there.
Yeah, I just want to ask you what you think about the term African American, because recently, with all the debacle about actress Raymond Simone saying she didn't want to identify as African American, just American. What do you make of the term African American? Do you think it's just another thing that we can't, like, Black Americans can't ever be accepted as fully American, that they have to categorize them as African American?
I think it's too many syllables. I'm serious. No, I prefer Black. African American, I understand why people use African American, but it's not my preference. I think she got into trouble because it's not an aesthetic judgment about the term African American. It's the whole notion of identifying with a race that's a problem. And that's really tough because I think it's hard for people to, she gets into trouble because people know that whatever she thinks about what she is, people see her as Black. You know, I mean, and no matter how privileged you are as Black or African American, you can be in situations, and you will be in situations, where your physical appearance, how people define you, will determine how they respond to you. And I think it's sort of, I mean, for me, it's almost sort of like wishful thinking on the part of people, that they wish that we could be beyond all of this or past all this, but we're not. And so as long as it's something that affects you, if you can be if you can be Black or African American, or not at Black or African American, only within a particular room or particular space, and then you step outside of that, and then it's all there again, then it's like a fantasy in a way. And so a fantasy I understand, because it's tiresome. You know, you ought to be able to just say, I'm a person or whatever, and just move on from that. But we just aren't there yet. And you can't, I mean, we have a Supreme Court now that is trying to deal with these issues by saying, you know, we don't want to focus on this at all. But what they really mean is, we don't want to do what the 14th Amendment was put in place to do, was to try, and the 13th Amendment too, is to try to figure out how do we repair some really serious damage that was done, not just to Blacks, but to the psyches of whites, convincing them about the inferiority of Blacks, the superiority of whites, that people can't ever meet as human beings. You can't just say, okay, it's over now, and then go on. So I think and she may be kind of walking that back, but yeah, African American, I think it's too many syllables. It's not, I mean, when I'm writing in the book, it's like, gosh, you know, how can I say that? I prefer Black as one, you know, it's quick, and it brings in everybody. It talks about the diaspora, and it talks about people not based upon, for me, it's not about, I think one of the great things that's happened in America with Blacks, African Americans, what I call them, is to make Blackness not just about skin color or about blood. It's about experiences. It's about the experiences that members of your family, it's a connection to grandmother, grandfather, great-grandmother, those kinds of connections that that say these are the people that we came from. And it's not about skin color, because black people who are very, very light-skinned, black people who are dark-skinned, kinky hair, straight hair, whatever, people identify as black because they're making a connection to relatives who were treated a particular way because of white supremacy. And that's an idea. And it's interesting, it hooks up with the idea of Americans, too, because being an American is an idea. You know, if you come to America and you say the words, and you say, yes, I believe these things, you are an American. There is not an American. I mean, George Bush is an American. You know, Louis Armstrong was an American. You know, Jennifer Lopez is an American. Whitney Houston was, I mean, all gamuts of all types of people. It's about an idea. And I think blackness for blacks in America, black Americans, has been about that. It hasn't been about blood in the way I think it has been in other places. It's this idea of your family and what has happened. And I think that's a very powerful thing, because then ideas can change and they can adapt. And it's not about race in a biological, you know, blood sense.
Thank you. I think Peter?
Yeah,
next?
you touched on some of the things I wanted to raise. We had a talk yesterday about Malcolm X coming to Britain. And often Malcolm X would give a talk which was about essentially into the fact that so many African Americans had white blood. Mm-hmm. And he would always, or typically would see that as the products of subjugation and rape. Mm-hmm. It would be an indictment of the white race. Mm-hmm. Do you think one of the things that Jefferson kind of represents for us is that moment of blindness about this invention of whiteness, that he just never quite got it, that whiteness was just something that was invented as well?
Yeah. Well, you know, being a figure, well, there are a couple of things. Number one, being born into a slave society. Jefferson says his first memory was of being handed up on a pillow to a slave. When he's a little boy, to be carried on a horse. The family's taking a trip. And when he dies, his grandchildren remember that he says something and nobody understands him. And the only person who understands what he's saying is a man named Burl Colbert, who was Sally Hemmings' nephew, who was his manservant at the end of his life. And he understands that Jefferson is saying that he wants to be raised up on the pillows. And so he adjusts the pillows. Jefferson closes his eyes and doesn't regain consciousness. He dies. So the first person he sees is a slave, a black slave, and the last person he sees is a black slave. So he's enmeshed in this society. He's also a figure of the Enlightenment, which has its good points and its bad points. And the bad point is the measurement point. This notion of hierarchies, everything has to be in a hierarchy. Newton, the Newtonian world as well, there are laws. And so he's looking around and he's saying, what are the laws here? And he reads this notion of, they talk about the notions of a hierarchy of races. And he accepts that. And he doesn't think about, doesn't challenge this notion of whiteness and what it means, and that it not only has a negative effect upon blacks. He thinks slavery has a negative effect upon white people, but he doesn't think that belief in race and buying into that has a negative effect on white people. He thinks that that's just the way it is. And the only way to deal with this is to have some kind of separation. So it's one way. It's not something that affects white. No, he doesn't. He doesn't get that at all. And because he thinks of it as a part of science, the beginning of sort of a racialized science.
Thank you, Annette. I think we have time, if it's okay, for one more question, if anybody would like to pose one. Yes, we have somebody in the middle here. Thanks, Katie.
As you know, Justice Harlan, one of the US Supreme Court justices, his father was a slave owner, and he fathered a child to one of his slaves. Do you think that a lot of Justice Harlan's decisions were influenced by the fact that he had a mixed-race brother?
Mm-hmm. You know, that's an interesting question. It's hard to say, because it wouldn't be something, it's not something that, you discuss or you get at, but it's an intriguing thought. And it shows that I was talking earlier about, someone asked me about how Jefferson has these views on one hand about, blacks and whites being in conflict, but at the same token evidently having not just a connection to Sally Hemmings, but treating the Hemmings family in a very, very different way, even though they're part black or considered black people. It definitely is something that could have been in his thinking and helping shape his understanding about race and the responsibilities that he had as a justice for trying to ensure that there would be at least some basic minimal level of fairness. But we can't know that, and I think that's one of the. Historians always have these things that just make you. It's like, I wish I knew. But this is something that's so taboo to talk about openly that it would be very, very tough to get at that. But that is something that it's worth knowing about him and worth pondering. Thank you.
I think we're going to close now, but I'd like us to all thank Annette, not only for the expertise, but also for the openness in answering our questions, and for thinking through with us not only ideas, but also opinions. Thank you for that.